Hey guys, this is Mr. Mahmood. Now I've already gone through the background of basic Mendelian genetics, and we started to scratch the surface a little bit with some out of the ordinary crosses with codominance and incomplete dominance. So now we're going to continue on with our discussion of advanced genetics and talk about some of the very unique scenarios that pull away from some of the basics that you've hopefully become very comfortable with after watching Genetics Lecture 1. We're going to talk about what are called sex-linked traits, which means traits that are specifically on your sex chromosomes and how they're unique in terms of coming up with the answers to certain problems. We'll talk about pedigrees, which are a way of representing traits from one generation to the next and actually using pedigrees to be able to turn around and identify the genotypes of each individual. This should round out everything you need to know about genetics and this entire unit. So let's get started. So then the next category of traits, after we understand basic codominance, is to get into another exception to what we normally are used to with basic crosses, and that's dealing with traits that aren't found on your autosomes. So think back to karyotypes. You remember a karyotype has 46 chromosomes in a normal human individual. The first 44 chromosomes are considered autosomal, which means they're the same whether you're a boy or a girl. The first 44 chromosomes, as long as there's no non-disjunctions or abnormalities, everyone has the same first 44 chromosomes. Doesn't matter whether you're a boy or a girl, you have the same first 22 pairs. What makes the guys and girls different from each other in terms of gender is that 23rd pair. So if a trait is on an autosomal chromosome, then it doesn't matter which one's the mom and which one's the dad, because they'll both have the same chance of contributing the same type of information. Because again, everybody has 2 of each of the first 22 pairs. However, if we're talking about a trait that's actually found on the sex chromosomes, now it matters which one is the mom and which one's the dad. Before it didn't matter. But if we're talking about a sex-linked trait, it absolutely matters, because depending on if you're a guy or a girl, you're giving different combinations of your alleles in terms of that final 23rd pair and that final gamete. So for example, just a quick review, we'll start here on the bottom. This bottom left picture represents a female egg. So if you're a female, remember again you have 46 chromosomes, first 22 pairs are autosomes, those last 2 are considered your sex chromosomes. Most females, with the exception of those Turner syndromes and things like that, have 2 X's in this position. So a female is what's considered XX, that's the female representation, and if you're a male, then you're representing XY, right? So of the 2 alleles at the very end, representing the 2 chromosomes there, you're giving either an X or a Y in every gamete. So the females, because they're XX, will always give one of their 2 X's, right? So a female will always donate an X to their offspring, and then the male will donate either an X or a Y, depending on which chromosome is sitting in that last position of that sperm that happens to get into the cell, right? We've talked about this before. You can actually use Punnett Squares here to understand and prove that there's a 50% chance of producing a boy or a girl. Let's break it down that way. Let's say that parent 1, since it's the one here at the top, we'll say is the male. Let's separate out those gametes. So every parent, every male parent, can either give an X in his 23rd position or a Y in his 23rd position. And half of the times he'll give an X, half the times he'll give a Y. So there'll be an X in this possibility or a Y for this possibility of gamete for the guy. For the female, because both of her alleles are X's in that 23rd position, both of her gamete possibilities will involve giving an X. So if you do this cross, you see that 50% of the time, the 2 will combine to produce a female, and 50% of the time, the 2 will combine to produce a male. So this proves that it's a 50-50 chance of having a boy or a girl. And remember, it's all about the dad. Depending on which of the 2 alleles the dad happens to pass on in that sperm that happens to be the one out of the millions that are all going after the same egg that actually is able to penetrate that egg and fertilize that first zygote, that's going to be what determines the gender of the offspring. So all of this is review. This is nothing new. Now let's say we're dealing with a trait that's actually found on that X chromosome. Now things are going to get interesting. So let's do some basic examples of different types of crosses related to that. First off, if there's a trait that's on the Y chromosome, there's no question who's going to be passing on that trait, and there's no question as to the gender of the offspring that would be receiving it, right? So hopefully there's no question. Let me ask. If there is a trait that's on the Y chromosome, and there are multiple traits on the Y chromosome, if there's a particular trait on the Y chromosome that I'm wanting to follow or see the likelihood of it getting passed on, if I have a female who's XX, and then I have a male who's XY. By the way, don't let that X fool you in the middle. That's just the cross between the 2. Which of the 2 actually has the ability of passing on the Y chromosome? Of course, that's just the dad. So if we're dealing with a trait that's on the Y chromosome, only the dads can pass it on. And then of the offspring, possible female offspring or possible male offsprings, which of the two offsprings could actually get that Y chromosome? Again, just the males. So if we're dealing with a Y chromosome trait, there's really no question about it. Only the dads can pass it on, and only the sons have a chance of getting it. There's not really any argument there, so we're not even going to waste time dealing with traits that are on the Y chromosome. What we're going to focus on is traits on the X, because both parents can contribute an X, but as hopefully you'll understand here, one of them definitely has a better chance than the other, and it's going to give for some very specific patterns of certain traits to get passed on and some rules that you can start to follow because of it. So since both males and females have an X chromosome, if there's a trait that's on the X that we're wanting to follow or make probabilities or predict the probability of offspring having certain traits, now we need to understand some basic things about it. So when we're dealing with sex-linked traits, we're dealing with traits specifically on sex chromosomes, and in this case we're only going to talk about traits on the X chromosome. So if there's a trait on the X chromosome that's dominant or recessive, we can't just use a random letter and just make it the capital and the lowercase and just leave it at that like we've been doing before. We have to designate it as actually being on the X, because it does matter whether we're male or female, because remember, females will give 2 of those chromosomes, or 2 of those alleles, I should say, and males will only give 1. So when we're dealing with traits that are on the X, we'll always keep the X as our letter, and then we're going to have superscripts, kind of like we did with codominance, to represent the different types of dominance. Now, there are a few different examples of sex-linked traits that we can talk about. One of the most common examples that is an actual sex-linked trait that is very much something that can be followed with one single trait, you can do the whole pedigree and Punnett square and set it all up for it, is colorblindness. Colorblindness is the lack of certain rods being produced in your eyes, which means you have a difficult time distinguishing between certain colors. Typically, the most common example of colorblindness is having a hard time distinguishing between reds and greens. People who are colorblind are the reason for traffic lights. If you ever look at traffic lights, and a lot of you guys are getting to the age where you're going to start following traffic laws and reading the handbook and taking your driving exam and things like that. Regardless of where you are in the world, when you hit a traffic light, you'll always see the red light either at the top or the left, and the green light either at the bottom or the right. And it's for a very specific reason, and it's because of people who are colorblind. If you're colorblind and you're trying to drive and you hit a stoplight, if it wasn't for the position, you'd have no idea which one was red and green. So imagine how difficult it would be for you to try to drive. So it's all about position, because those people can't tell the difference. So someone who's colorblind can't distinguish between reds and greens typically, or has issues with those colors. Colorblindness is a sex-linked recessive trait. Here's what that means. There are 2 possibilities of that trait. So let's say we can either have normal vision or you can be colorblind. So since the normal vision is the dominant, let's use the letter N. So since it's on the X chromosome, you can either be X capital N or X lowercase n. X capital N represents normal vision, and X lowercase n represents being colorblind. I'll just write CB there. Okay, so that's the recessive allele, is the colorblind trait. So you can have any combinations of these, and again, it will make a difference whether you're a male or female. Females will have 2 X's to work with. Males will have only 1 X and 1 Y to work with. So let's think about each given scenario here of male to female. Let's say that I have this possibility. Okay, homozygous XN. If these are my 2 alleles in my 23rd pair, first off, am I male or female? Both X's, female, right? And do I have normal or colorblind vision? In this case, both of my X's are normal. So this represents a normal female. I'm going to write NF. Okay? Now let's say I have this scenario. First off, am I male or female? I'm male. I have the Y, so I'm male. And the only X that I have is capital. So what does that tell me about my vision? Normal. So this represents a normal male. Most of the human population falls into one of these 2 categories. Okay? Now let's say I have this. First off, male or female? Female, exactly. Now, do I have normal vision? Do I have colorblind, or do I have anything in between? This is not any example of codominance or incomplete dominance here. This is normal Mendelian dominance. So if you have at least one dominant allele, you show for the dominant trait. So in this case, does this female have normal vision or is she colorblind? She's normal. Her vision is just as good as the one at the top. So this is a normal vision female. But the big difference between the two is this one carries the recessive allele. We talked about carriers briefly before. If you're a carrier for the recessive allele, that's another example of being heterozygous or hybrid for the trait. So because she's heterozygous for this trait, even though she's normal, she's actually a carrier. So I'm going to write C here to represent a carrier for that trait. So even though she's normal, she can pass on the recessive X. That's important to understand here. Okay, let's give another scenario. Let's say you have this genotypic combination. First off, male or female? This is a male. That male's only X is recessive. So does this male have normal vision or is he colorblind? This is our first scenario of a colorblind individual. Here is a colorblind male. The colorblind male's only X is recessive, so he automatically shows for that recessive trait. Okay, and then the final scenario of combinations that are possible here would be an X with two recessive ends. First off, male or female? Female, and both of her X's are recessive, so which trait does she show for? She too is colorblind. So here are two scenarios of actual individuals who show for the sex-linked recessive trait. And this is how their genotypes have to be in that 23rd position to actually show for it. Now, just from looking at this, you should be able to see that there is actually one gender that's more likely to show for a sex-linked recessive trait than another. And you might think about this. If you know anybody who's ever colorblind, think back and ask your friends or ask your family if they know anybody in their family or anybody that's colorblind. Anyone who says yes, most of the time, if you ask them what gender that person that's colorblind is, what do you think they're going to say? They're boys. They're male. Exactly. Sex-linked recessive traits are much more common in males than they are in females. And let's see if we can figure out why. So let's do some crosses here and give some basic scenarios. Let's say it's always going to be crossing with a male or female, right? So one of the parents will always be XX, the other parent will always be XY. Let's say I'm crossing a fully homozygous normal female with a colorblind male. So let's do this cross right here. I'm going to cross a normal female with a colorblind male. Okay? Just for the sake of consistency with the last cross, let's do this male at the top. So the male's X is recessive, and then here's his Y. The female has both dominant X's. So if I'm doing this cross, what's the likelihood of producing different types of offspring? First off, it's 50-50, male to female. We already talked about this. XX compared to XY. Now, each X is going to have one of these specific superscripts. So in this case, this female would be a carrier female. She's normal, but she can pass on the recessive trait. Same thing would be the one underneath it. Always keep the capital letter before the lowercase, just like everything else we've been talking about. And in terms of the males that are being produced, in this case, 100% of the males will be normal. So there are two possible genotypes represented here, and two possible phenotypes as well. Of the females, 100% of the female offspring will be carriers for colorblindness in this case, and 100% of the males will be completely normal. So in this situation, even though they have a colorblind dad, none of the kids will be colorblind. And it's all because of the mom. Because the mom is 100% normal, 100% of her offspring will always get at least one of these X's, which is true about the guys as well. And this is one of the key things you need to understand. A guy, because he's XY, will always get that X from his mom. That's one very important rule you need to make sure you remember. Sons will receive their X's from their mom. With the exception of these Klinefelter syndromes and things like that, or these non-disjunctions, 99.9% of the time, which is what we're going to focus on right now, the X for a son, for a male, will come from mom. Because the Y that made him male came from dad. So because that second allele came from dad and it was a Y, that's what made him male, the other allele, the X, had to come from mom. So mothers will always pass an X to their child, regardless of male or female. Mother will always give an X to the daughter, and mother will always give an X to the son. So mother will always pass her X on to her child. Now think about the dad. Which gender of child do you think the dad will pass his X to? Yeah, so here's another very important rule you need to remember. Fathers can only pass their X to their daughters. Okay? Fathers can only pass on an X trait to daughters. Because what are they passing on to their sons? The X or the Y? The Y, exactly. So another very important rule. Fathers can only pass on their sex-linked recessive or dominant, whatever the sex-linked trait is on the X, to their daughters. Fathers can only pass on X's to their daughters. Mothers can pass X's on to both sons or daughters, any combination of the two. So using that, we can kind of think of some more patterns here. Beyond talking about just sex-linked traits, any kind of trait can be followed and tracked through multiple generations through what's called a pedigree. So a pedigree is what you see here. It shows the multiple generations and following very specific traits. You can have the same family line, and you'll see this. We're going to show 3 different pedigrees of the exact same family history, but we're going to follow 3 different traits. One of them is going to be something we consider an autosomal dominant trait, which is this one here. One of them is going to be autosomal recessive, and the third is going to be sex-linked recessive. So even though they're the same people, they're going to be shaded differently because they're going to either show for or not show for particular traits that we're following. So it all depends on what we're tracking. In this case, you can identify this as an autosomal dominant trait. Again, autosomal means it's not sex-linked, so we don't have to worry about any X's and Y's. It doesn't matter which one's really male or female. Everyone has equal opportunity and equal chance of showing for the trait. There are a few ways to show for an autosomal dominant trait. We'll talk about the others a little bit later. Autosomal dominant traits are just like the basic crosses that we've been doing before, where you just have one letter. There's either capital letter is dominant, lowercase letter is recessive. Let's pick a letter in this case. Let's say we're talking about the letter A. So capital A is dominant, lowercase a is recessive, right? Now, if someone is affected, then they're shaded in with whatever the shade is in this case. If someone is unaffected, then they're not shaded in. And in this case, you can see on the key, the shaded in individuals are red, the non-shaded individuals are blue. Usually your activities will be done in black and white, so the ones that are black or shaded in are the ones that are affected with the particular trait that you're following. So depending on the trait, they can be shaded in one pedigree and not shaded in on another. It depends on what you're following. Like, I have black hair, so if we're following black hair, I'd be shaded in. But if we're following blue eyes, then I'm not shaded in. So it depends on what we're tracking. In this case, we're tracking a particular trait that's autosomal dominant. So this is just a regular dominant trait. The capital A has to be present. So if you have at least one capital A, you show for the dominant trait. Another key thing to understand is the shapes. Anytime you see a square that represents a male, anytime you see a circle that represents a female. When we're talking about autosomal traits, their gender doesn't matter, but it is important to be able to see how their family connections are. And so you can make certain assumptions here based on this family tree. You'll notice that the pedigrees are arranged in a pretty organized manner. It's all kind of noticed on the same horizontal line representing generations. So this first line represents generation 1. You'll typically see it in Roman numerals. The second generation, represented by the second row. Generation 3, can't write, sorry. Generation 3 is represented there, and generation 4 is represented here. And then within each row, each individual is usually represented from left to right numerically. So this first square is representing 1, 1. Generation 1, person 1. This one here, the female, represents 1, 2. Generation 1, person 2, and so on. So the second generation, this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Generation 3, this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And generation 3, this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So you can describe each of these people by using 2 numbers. The first number is their generation, the second number is where they are in the line. So for example, you can say that 1, 1 is 2, 5's father. And 2, 5 is 1, 1's dad. Right? How are 3, 6 and 1, 1 related? Grandfather and grandchild. 1, 1 is 3, 6's grandfather. The way you can see that is by following these lines. Anytime you see a line connecting to square and a circle, just like these, represent those two being the parents. So mother, father. This usually represents marriage, right? Not necessarily always marriage, but these are the two parents, right? So anytime you see a horizontal line connecting two shapes, those are the two parents. And then any deviation of the line that comes off of it represents their children. So for example, 1, 1 and 1, 2 had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 children. They only had 5 children. Notice how these two are not the actual children of this family. These two both married into the family because they don't have direct lines connecting to the actual cross. So 1, 1 and 1, 2 actually only had 5 kids, even though there are 7 people in this line, and so on. So you can see, you can make certain connections about family history and their connections to each other. Alright, that being said, let's focus in on why this particular pedigree represents an autosomal dominant trait. If it's a dominant trait, you know that means that the individual, if we're using the letter A here, the individual has to be either homozygous dominant or heterozygous to show for the dominant trait. So this represents an affected person. If they have at least one dominant A, then they show for the dominant trait and they'd be affected by that trait. The only way to show for the recessive trait is if you're homozygous recessive. So the dominant trait is fairly common. If you see that within any given pedigree, the people that are affected are found in every single generation, and every individual affected has at least one parent that's also affected, then we're dealing with an autosomal dominant trait. In this case, you can see that's true. With the exception of this top generation, we don't know about her parents, but every affected individual has at least one parent that was affected as well. There's not any situation where this skips a generation. If you ever see 2 unaffected parents that have a child that's affected, it can't be dominant. There's no way, because if they passed on the dominant allele, they would have to be dominant as well. So if you ever see 2 unaffected parents that don't have something, or they're not affected, and they have a child that is, that's not a dominant trait. You can't skip a generation with a dominant trait. So in this situation, because there's no skipping of generations, every person that has it has at least a parent that has it as well. This is what we consider dominant. And if you see it's dominant, let's go ahead and assume it's autosomal dominant. It's a little too difficult to distinguish between sex-linked and autosomal. So for the sake of discussion, unless we tell you otherwise, if you see a dominant trait, assume it's autosomal dominant, which means you don't have to worry about X's and Y's here at all. So in this case, just by looking at the different traits, you can identify their genotypes. So if someone is affected, that means they have to have at least one dominant allele, right? The second one we're not sure about. It could be either a second capital A, or it could be recessive A and be heterozygous. Either way, they'd be affected by the dominant trait. So all we can say for sure is all of these individuals that have the affected trait have at least one capital A. Notice I'm not doing X's and Y's here because this isn't a sex-linked trait. It's autosomal. It doesn't matter whether you're male or female in terms of your genotype. Now all of the other people, we can say definitively that if they don't show for the affected trait, they have to be homozygous recessive. So you can go through and identify the actual genotypes of each of these individuals, because the only way to not show for a dominant trait is to actually be recessive. Now you may be surprised at how the dominant trait's not showing up as often as you would normally expect the dominant trait to show. That's because not all dominant traits are super common. There's a very good example of a dominant trait that's really rare in the population. It's called polydactyly, having multiple digits, more than just 5 fingers on each hand or on your toes. People with polydactyly have at least one extra digit or an extension of a finger, something like that, off of one of their fingers. This is actually a dominant trait, but you don't see it very often at all. So just because it's dominant doesn't mean it's common. Most of the human population are homozygous recessive for the polydactyly trait, which means we don't have the ability of passing on the dominant allele. So don't just assume because you don't see a lot of people affected, it must be recessive. Follow the rules. So what we can do now is go try to figure out what the second A is for each of these individuals that are affected. And this is where it gets fun. All of you guys that like riddles and puzzles and things like that, you can really start working your understanding of genetics to try to solve these problems. Let's see what we can figure out. So what if I told you, I can say definitively that this parent, this female, the grandmother, the first generation mother here, has to be heterozygous for the trait. How did I prove that? There are 2 of her kids that show me this has to be true. First off, these kids, generation 2-1, 2-2, and 2-7 all have a dominant A, which means they had to get that dominant A from mom. Dad only has recessive A's to give, therefore every one of their children will get a recessive A from dad. So I know that the mother has to have at least one dominant A. That other A I'm saying is recessive specifically because of these two people right here. Generations 2-4 and 2-5. Not 3 or 6, because again, they're not part of the bloodline. They're actually married in. But 2-4 and 2-5 are homozygous recessive. We know one of the recessive A's had to come from dad, but that means the second recessive A, or the first, one of those two recessive A's had to come from mom. So that means mom has to have a recessive A to give, which would make her heterozygous for the trait. Now let's do an autosomal recessive trait. Now look, it's the same bloodline. If you look, it's the same people. Squares, circles, number of people in every generation, everything's the same. Except now we're going to follow a different trait, which means they're not shaded the same way. We're going to first figure out if this represents dominant or recessive. And again, the basic rule, if someone is affected, and there's affected in this case, that means that they're actually fully shaded in. That's someone who's fully affected. If it's dominant, that means that there can't be an individual that's fully affected that has two parents that are not actually affected. And if you look here, there are a lot of people that are half shaded, like these people here are like half shaded in. These people are not actually affected, but they're carriers for the trait. So if you ever see people who are half shaded in, it's not always something like a diagonal line. Sometimes it's shaded down the middle, one side or the other shaded in. Sometimes you'll see like a bullseye, a dot in the middle. All of those represent carriers for a trait. So they don't actually show for the trait, but they can pass it on. Just the fact that you see these means this has to be a recessive trait. You can't be a carrier for a dominant trait. If you have the dominant allele, you show for the dominant trait. So if you see any carriers in the pedigree, automatically you know that it's recessive. Now in this case, we're making it obvious that there are carriers. That's not always going to be the case. Sometimes they just won't be shaded in at all if they're not fully affected. So most of the times you have to think a little harder than what you see here. But here's the basic breakdown of telling if it's dominant or recessive. If it's recessive, remember that means it can skip a generation. So there has to be a situation where a fully affected individual has two parents that are unaffected. And as you can see, that happens here. Right here, this child, 2-2, generation 2, number 2, this male, is fully affected, and he has two parents that are not affected. So those two parents are not affected by the trait, and they have a child that is affected. That means it skipped a generation, which means this has to be a recessive trait. Okay? Now the fact that it's a recessive trait alone isn't enough to distinguish between autosomal recessive or sex-linked recessive. And this doesn't do the best justice for it, but here are the basic rules to follow. The basic difference between autosomal and sex-linked. If it's a sex-linked recessive trait, you should remember this from before. If you're a daughter that has the affected trait, that means the father must also be affected. Right, let's think back. If you have a daughter that's affected with a sex-linked recessive trait, that means dad has to have his only X as recessive, and mom has to be at least a carrier, right? So if the daughter is affected, the father must also be affected. So any affected daughter, look for any circles that are fully affected, and go up to look at the parents. And if the parents are have the father that's also affected, then it's possible that this is sex-linked. Another thing is you should see it more often in males than you should see in females. Now in this case, there's only one actual affected individual. It does happen to be a male. That's not conclusive in terms of distinguishing between the two. I'm going to tell you that this is an autosomal recessive, and we're going to practice it as an autosomal recessive trait. So let's think of this as autosomal recessive. Let's follow the same basic alleles that we had before. Capital A is dominant, lowercase a is recessive, except this time we're tracking the recessive allele. We're actually following the recessive trait. So people that are shaded in actually have the recessive trait. People that are unaffected or maybe half shaded do not show for the recessive trait, they show for the dominant. So that means the only person that I can say definitively is homozygous recessive is my only fully affected individual. And I'm not dealing with X's and Y's because I'm telling you this is an autosomal recessive trait. So this individual is the only one that's fully homozygous recessive. All of the ones that are fully unaffected, the fully normal ones, in this case I can say for sure are homozygous dominant because they don't have any ability of showing for the other trait, right, all the way down the line. The other individuals I can say for sure are heterozygous because of this pedigree. But I may not always give you this information. So let's assume that you didn't know all of these people were heterozygous for the trait. So that means you would start by just saying, since they're not fully affected, they all have to have at least one dominant allele. So we'll just leave it at that for now. And then you can do the same sort of detective work to figure out the rest. In fact, I kept 3 of these blank so that we can try to figure it out ourselves. So we don't know anything about these 3 individuals except what's being passed around us. And let's see if we can figure out what's going on in terms of possibilities for these children. And in this case, they can all be given to us very easily by looking at their parents. All 3 of these are siblings. All 3 of these are brothers and sisters of generation 2, numbers 2 and 3. What can I say is true about all 3 of these individuals in terms of their genotype? Hopefully you've gotten pretty good at this, and you can tell me that all 3 of these are going to be heterozygous for the trait, which means they're all going to be half affected by this particular trait. And you should have been able to figure that out because all 3 of them are going to receive 1 A from mom and 1 A from dad. The A from mom will always be dominant because that's all she has to give. So all 3 of them are going to get a dominant A from mom, and all 3 of them are going to get a recessive A from dad, which means 100% of them will be heterozygous for that trait. The last practice with pedigrees we're going to do here is with one that is representing a sex-linked recessive trait. Again, to figure out if something is dominant or recessive, you can see that it skips generations. In this case, we have individuals that are affected. This happens a few times. We have an affected individual whose parents are both unaffected. Even if they're carriers for the trait, they're both considered unaffected for that particular trait. So we know this is a recessive trait. And then again, to identify it as sex-linked recessive, a few things have to be true. One, it should be more common in males than it is in females. And in this case, all the ones except for the 2 we're going to figure out here. 3 of the 4 are male, which is more common. So that's a good indicator. And the second key one is that all the females that are affected have to have affected fathers. If a female is affected with a sex-linked recessive trait, the father has to also be affected. Remember the whole recessive X? One of those 2 has to come from dad. He only has 1 to give, so he has to also be affected. The only female that we see here for sure that has it, again, we're not sure about down here, we're going to figure it out. We don't know about her parents because she married in, so that's not enough of an indicator. So again, this is a little bit of a gray area about which of the 2 it may be, but this one I'm going to tell you is a sex-linked recessive trait, and we're going to treat it that way. So once we distinguish this is sex-linked, that means we can't just follow normal genotypes anymore. Now we have to worry about X's and Y's. So in this case, we are going to do XX for females, XY for male, and we're going to distinguish between the X's. So let's say the capital A represents a normal X, or the dominant trait. The recessive A represents the disorder, whatever it is that we're following. Okay, whatever the colorblindness, hemophilia, any of those stuff that we're following before, that's what we're following here with the recessive X. So now it does matter whether we're dealing with squares or circles. So before we do anything else, I'm going to go through and identify my males and females. So anything with a square is going to be XY, and I'm going to leave a little space here for the X so that I can mark what kind of X it is. Any female is going to be XX. Again, I'm going to leave a space. So I'm just going to go all the way through here and distinguish as either XX or XY. Alright, so I'm skipping ahead now. So here I am with all my X's and Y's already broken down. Now I'm going to try to figure out what the others are. And again, I'm making this easy on you because I'm giving you the fact that some of these are carriers for the trait, but you may not get that. In fact, you probably won't get that. So as far as you are concerned, if you were to get this in a normal classroom, the only things that would be shaded in are the 4 fully affected individuals. You would have to figure out that the other ones that are half shaded are the actual carriers for the trait. But what you can say for sure, of all the people that are unaffected, you can identify males, females, some certain rules to follow from it. Let's start with the males. I have 3 males that are affected with a sex-linked recessive trait. It's skipping generations, so we know it's recessive. So that means all of my affected males, their only X has to be recessive. So I'm going to go ahead and distinguish that. So that's one thing I can do. So that means my remaining males, their only X has to be dominant. If they're not affected with this recessive trait, that means their only X has to be dominant. So I'm going to go through, find all my males, and distinguish them as dominant. Okay, we're going to leave this one blank because we're not sure what's going on with that one. We'll come back to that one. Alright, now it's looking at my females. The only one affected female here so far has to be homozygous recessive, so that means both of her X's has to be recessive. The remaining females all have to have at least one dominant X. They all have to be normal. At least one dominant X in order to not show for the disorder. So at least one of their X's will be dominant. And again, we'll leave this one blank. So what I would do next, if I didn't already tell you which ones were carriers or not, would be to figure out what the second X is for all of these unaffected females. And there are different ways that we can figure this out. Again, oh sorry, it should be capital there. So again, some ways to do this. Let's look, for example, at generation 1, number 2, this female right here. She had a child. Again, we're sitting at generation 2, number 2. This guy gives away a lot in a lot of the different pedigrees, apparently. She had a child who has the trait. Let's say it's colorblindness. This boy is colorblind. We know the Y had to come from dad, so that X had to come from mom. So even though she's unaffected, she has to be a carrier for the trait. So you could figure it out even if I didn't tell you that she has to be a carrier. Okay. This other one here, it would be difficult to distinguish this as which one, as either homozygous normal or a carrier, because she didn't have any kids and the parent's information is inconclusive. We know that one of the X's came from dad, so we know that she has to have a dominant X from dad. That means the other X came from mom, and mom has a 50-50 chance of giving either one. So literally it's a 50% chance that this would be another dominant, or 50% that it would be recessive. So there's not enough information here to say that this would be a carrier if I didn't already tell you it was. But you could figure out some of the other ones along the way. Let's see if we can figure out, let's focus on the two here at the bottom. I didn't tell you which ones they were, and you should be able to tell me what they are just from looking at the cross. If you're looking at it properly, you should be able to tell me very quickly about both of the children there, the daughter and the son of generation 3, 7, and 8. You should be able to tell me very quickly about both of these children. If you look at all the X's, all we have are recessive X's. So that means 100% of the offspring are going to get a recessive X from mom. So one of them has to be recessive. That means the only X that this son gets is recessive, so automatically we know he's going to be colorblind. And in terms of the daughter, if the dad's colorblind, he has to give that recessive X as well. So that means that daughter's going to be colorblind as well. And this is that rule. If this was true and we knew this, we can say for sure this has to be sex-linked recessive, because every daughter that's affected, every woman, her dad is affected as well. And you see that's true here. The father's affected because that X is what was passed on to the daughter. And the daughter has to get an X from dad that's recessive and an X from mom in order to be colorblind. And in terms of the colorblind son, he's not colorblind because of his dad. His dad didn't contribute anything in terms of the colorblind trait to him. His dad gave his Y. That made him male. The X had to come from mom. So it's actually mom that made him colorblind, not dad. So some things to think about there. So you can break this down and figure that out that way. So pedigrees are a way to really analyze what you know, and a really good high-level application of everything at the end of the line. So make sure you're comfortable doing this. Most kids find this fun because this is the problem-solving part, like riddles or puzzles that they get along the way. That's it, guys. That's it for genetics. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Take it all in, and I will see you next time.